The flight to nowhere. Kevin Parker stood at the edge of the bustling airport terminal, his hand gripping the handle of his worn leather carry-on bag. The scent of jet fuel and freshly brewed coffee filled the air, a combination that brought a sense of calm and familiarity. Kevin was no stranger to airports. In fact, he spent most of his professional life either in them or in the skies above. As a seasoned pilot with over 2 decades of experience, Kevin had seen more takeoffs and landings than most people could imagine. But today, Kevin wasn't here to fly the plane. At least, not in the way he was accustomed to. Today, he was just another passenger. Don't forget to subscribe. Dressed in a sharp, tailored navy blue suit, Kevin moved with an air of quiet confidence. His 6'3" frame towered over most of the other travelers in the terminal, his stride unhurried but purposeful. At 44, he had a presence that was hard to ignore: salt and pepper hair, a well-trimmed beard, and eyes that carried the weight of years spent navigating the open skies. However, for all his outward poise, Kevin was looking forward to this flight for a very different reason than his usual work-related journeys. For once, he would simply be a passenger, allowing someone else to take the reins. He had no idea, though, that his respite would be short-lived. As he approached the first-class check-in counter, he adjusted the strap of his bag over his shoulder, inadvertently revealing a corner of his pilot's license tucked into the side pocket. His thoughts briefly drifted to the many times he had stood in uniform at the helm of an aircraft, guiding hundreds of passengers safely to their destinations. But today, his focus was on a much-needed vacation. He had earned it after all. At the check-in counter stood Sarah Connolly, a blonde flight attendant with meticulously coiffed hair and a sharp, polished appearance. She was busy greeting passengers with a wide smile, but the moment her eyes landed on Kevin, the smile faltered for a fraction of a second. She looked him up and down, her gaze lingering on his dark skin and expensive-looking attire. For a moment, her expression was unreadable, but as Kevin stepped forward, she composed herself. "Excuse me, sir," she said, her tone cool, with just the faintest trace of sarcasm. "Are you sure you're in the right line? The economy boarding is over there." She gestured vaguely behind her, her smile more of a smirk than a genuine expression of warmth. Kevin blinked, momentarily taken aback. He had seen this kind of thing before, a subtle form of discrimination wrapped in a veneer of professionalism. He had experienced it on more occasions than he could count, but it never ceased to sting. He held his boarding pass out without a word, his face impassive. There was no need to explain himself or his qualifications to anyone. Sarah snatched the pass from his hand, her manicured nails tapping impatiently against the screen as she scanned it. Her eyes flickered with surprise when she saw his first-class seat assignment, but she quickly masked it with a tight smile. "Enjoy your flight, Mr. Parker," she said, her voice now clipped and cold. Kevin nodded in acknowledgement and moved past her, aware of the whispers that followed. The jet bridge was crowded with passengers shuffling toward the plane, and Kevin let his mind wander, hoping to escape the subtle tension that had already started to brew. He found his seat easily enough, -4A, a spacious first-class window seat. Settling in, he stored his bag in the overhead compartment before taking the deep breath. The leather seat was soft and comforting beneath him as he closed his eyes for a moment, hoping to leave the airport's brief hostility behind. The passengers filed in, filling up the seats around him, and Kevin's attention drifted to the small details of the plane's interior. He wasn't one to make quick judgments, but it didn't take long to realize that Sarah wasn't the only flight attendant with an attitude. As the cabin crew bustled about, prepping for takeoff, it became clear that Sarah's earlier coldness wasn't an isolated incident. Kevin glanced up just in time to catch Sarah casting a quick, disapproving look in his direction as she handed a drink to the woman across the aisle. The woman smiled brightly at Sarah, who responded with a honeyed tone. The contrast in Sarah's behavior was striking. The warmth she offered other passengers was completely absent when she addressed Kevin. When Sarah reached Kevin's row, her smile was gone. She didn't even make eye contact as she slapped a napkin onto his tray table, followed by a plastic cup of water. The cup teetered slightly, sloshing droplets onto the napkin. "Here you go," she muttered, her tone dismissive. She turned on her heel without waiting for a response, her back stiff with barely concealed contempt. Kevin watched her walk away, his expression unreadable. He was no stranger to microaggressions or outright prejudice, but something about the setting, a confined space 35,000 feet in the air, made it harder to shake off. He had nowhere to go, no way to simply walk away from the situation. Instead, he steeled himself, refusing to let Sarah's behavior ruin his day. As the flight progressed, Kevin couldn't help but notice the way Sarah seemed to light up around the other first-class passengers, laughing with them, offering impeccable service with a wide, gleaming smile. But when it came to Kevin, she was cold, curt, and visibly annoyed. It wasn't long before other passengers began to take notice. A few rows back, an older woman with silver hair whispered something to her husband, her eyes darting between Sarah and Kevin. The man nodded subtly, his expression troubled. Even the younger flight attendant, Alex, who had been moving quietly through the aisles, seemed uncomfortable. He glanced at Kevin more than once, offering an apologetic smile, as if he wanted to intervene but didn't know how. Kevin stayed silent, trying to focus on the steady hum of the engines and the slight vibration of the plane beneath his feet. It wasn't until Sarah made another round through the cabin that things escalated. As she approached the well-dressed man seated across the aisle from Kevin, she bent down to offer him a drink. "Would you like anything else, sir?" she asked, her voice dripping with sweetness. The man, oblivious to her earlier behavior, shook his head politely. "No, thank you." Sarah straightened and, with a pointed glance at Kevin, leaned in slightly toward the man. Her voice lowered, but not enough to escape Kevin's sharp hearing. "It's interesting who they let fly first class these days, isn't it?" Kevin's jaw tightened, but he remained silent, his eyes fixed on the seat in front of him. The comment wasn't lost on the man across the aisle, either. He glanced at Kevin, then back at Sarah, his face flushing with discomfort. But like so many others, he chose not to say anything, opting instead to awkwardly return to his magazine. The air in the cabin seemed to grow heavier, tension thickening as more passengers began to sense the growing divide between Sarah's treatment of Kevin and her treatment of everyone else. A few passengers exchanged uneasy glances, and the whispers grew more frequent. Kevin took a deep breath, centering himself. He was used to being underestimated, used to having to prove himself in ways that others weren't. But today, he wasn't interested in proving anything. He just wanted to get through the flight without incident. Little did he know, though, that the events about to unfold would force him to step into a role he had long left behind, one that would change everything for those aboard this flight. As the plane reached cruising altitude, and the cabin crew began their routine service, an announcement crackled over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your co-pilot speaking. We are encountering some turbulence ahead, so please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened." The cabin crew snapped into action, moving quickly to secure loose items and ensure that passengers were prepared for the upcoming turbulence. But Kevin's instincts told him that something wasn't right. The co-pilot's voice had sounded strained, not the usual calm professionalism he was used to hearing. Something about the way the plane shuddered beneath him made him uneasy. And then it happened. A sudden, sharp jolt that sent passengers gripping their armrests in alarm. The plane dipped, then leveled off again, but not without leaving a sense of foreboding in the air. Kevin's pilot instincts kicked in as he scanned the faces of the cabin crew, noting their unease. His hand moved unconsciously to his bag, where his pilot's license lay hidden, a reminder of who he truly was and what he was capable of. Whatever was happening in the cockpit, Kevin knew it wasn't just a routine flight anymore. The real test was about to begin. Turbulence of a different kind. The plane shuddered once more, and this time, the turbulence felt different, unnatural, as if the aircraft was fighting something beyond the typical atmospheric disturbances. Kevin's senses, honed over years of flying in and out of chaotic skies, picked up on the subtle nuances that most passengers would miss. His pulse quickened, but not from fear. It was the adrenaline, the familiar edge of readiness that he had felt countless times in the cockpit. The other passengers were not so calm. Nervous whispers began to ripple through the cabin, their eyes darting toward the flight attendants, searching for any sign of reassurance. But there was none. Sarah moved mechanically through the cabin, her usual cool demeanor now tinged with tension. Gone was the smug confidence she had earlier displayed. In its place was the pale mask of someone barely keeping it together. Kevin watched her carefully as she passed his row. She was muttering something to herself, her hands trembling as she rearranged the drink cart with more force than necessary. The cracks in her facade were beginning to show, and Kevin knew this was only the beginning. Just then, the intercom crackled again, and this time, the voice was even more strained. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are encountering a bit more turbulence than expected. Please remain seated, and flight attendants, return to your seats for safety." Kevin's grip on the armrest tightened. That wasn't a standard message. Something was wrong. His gaze shifted to the front of the cabin, toward the cockpit door. The hairs on the back of his neck stood up, his instincts screaming at him to act, but he stayed seated, knowing full well that the crew was trained to handle situations like this, unless, of course, things got worse. The plane lurched again, more violently this time, causing a few gasps and shrieks from the passengers. Sarah, who had been trying to steady herself by gripping the back of a seat, lost her balance momentarily, her face blanching. Kevin's eyes met hers for a brief moment, and in that fleeting second, he saw something unexpected. Fear, the kind of fear that told him this situation was far from under control. As if on cue, the intercom cut back on, but this time, there was no message. Instead, static filled the cabin, followed by muffled voices. Kevin's trained ear picked up on what was happening. A heated exchange between the cockpit crew. The captain's voice, strained and panicked, filtered through the static, though the words were unclear. Kevin's heart sank. This wasn't just turbulence. Something was seriously wrong with the aircraft. Suddenly, the cockpit door swung open, and the co-pilot, a young man in his early 30s, staggered out. His face was ashen, and he stumbled slightly as he approached the nearest flight attendant. Sarah and Alex, who had been frozen in place, snapped to attention as the co-pilot leaned in close, his voice barely audible but urgent. "The captain. He's unresponsive," the co-pilot stammered, his voice cracking. "I can't handle this alone. We're in serious trouble. We need help. Fast." Kevin's breath caught in his throat. The captain was unresponsive. His mind raced through the possibilities. Heart attack, stroke, sudden illness. Whatever it was, the captain was incapacitated, and now the fate of everyone on board rested in the hands of a single co-pilot who was clearly overwhelmed. Sarah's face went white as she absorbed the news. She turned to Alex, her voice trembling as she whispered something frantically in his ear. Alex, wide-eyed and visibly shaken, nodded before sprinting toward the galley, leaving Sarah standing there, her professional facade crumbling before everyone's eyes. For a few moments, Kevin remained still, watching the chaos unfold around him. He had been in tight situations before, had faced emergencies in the air, but never from the perspective of a passenger. His mind flickered to the contents of his bag, the pilot's license, the proof of his years of experience. His instincts screamed at him to intervene, to do something, but he hesitated. Would they listen to him? Would they even trust him in a situation like this? As if the universe had made the decision for him. The plane suddenly dipped sharply, sending a collective scream through the cabin. Drinks spilled, bags shifted in the overhead compartments, and passengers clutched their armrests in terror. Kevin felt the familiar drop in his stomach, the unmistakable sensation of losing altitude too quickly. He stood up. There was no more time for hesitation. Kevin's body moved before his mind could fully catch up. He navigated through the narrow aisle, his long strides purposeful as he made his way to the front of the plane. Passengers stared at him, some in confusion, others in outright panic. Sarah, still frozen in place near the cockpit door, looked at him as if seeing him for the first time. "You need help," Kevin said, his voice firm and steady. It wasn't a question. It was a statement. "I'm a pilot. Let me in there." For a moment, Sarah just stared at him, her face pale, her lips parted as if she couldn't comprehend what he was saying. She blinked rapidly, her eyes darting from Kevin to the co-pilot, who was still in a state of near panic. The cabin shuddered again as the turbulence grew worse, and Sarah finally snapped out of her daze. "You're a pilot," she stammered, her voice barely audible over the hum of the engines. "Yes," Kevin replied, his tone leaving no room for doubt. "And you don't have time to question it. Let me in." The co-pilot, overhearing the exchange, turned to Kevin, his expression one of desperate hope. "Please," he muttered, "we need help." Without another word, Sarah stepped aside, and Kevin brushed past her, entering the cockpit. The scene inside was worse than he had imagined. The captain was slumped in his seat, unconscious, his face alarmingly pale. The instrument panel was lit up like a Christmas tree, flashing warnings and alerts in every direction. The co-pilot had been trying to manage the plane alone, but it was clear that he was out of his depth. Kevin assessed the situation in an instant, his mind switching into pilot mode. The co-pilot's hands were trembling as he struggled to keep the plane level, and the control stick wobbled precariously in his grip. Kevin quickly slid into the captain's seat, his fingers moving over the controls with practiced ease. "Get the oxygen mask on him," Kevin instructed the co-pilot, nodding toward the unconscious captain. "And pull up the nearest emergency landing locations. We need to get this bird down. Fast." The co-pilot snapped into action, placing the mask over the captain's face and then fumbling with the flight computer to find the nearest airport. Kevin, meanwhile, took control of the plane, his hand steady on the yoke as he fought to stabilize the aircraft. Outside, the sky was a churning mass of clouds, the turbulence relentless as the plane rocked violently. "Mayday, Mayday, this is Flight 262, requesting immediate emergency landing clearance," Kevin said into the radio, his voice calm and authoritative. "Captain is incapacitated. I have control of the aircraft. Request vectors to the nearest airport." There was a moment of static, then a reply came through, the voice on the other end tense but professional. "Flight 262, we have you on radar. You are cleared for emergency landing at Yorkton Regional Airport, 100 miles southeast. Turn heading 135 and begin descent." Kevin acknowledged the instructions, his hand steady as he guided the plane through the turbulent skies. The situation was critical, but his years of experience kicked in like second nature. He tuned out the noise, the fear, the uncertainty, focusing only on the task at hand, getting the plane and its passengers safely on the ground. Behind him, the co-pilot was still breathing heavily, clearly rattled by the situation, but he managed to pull up the necessary data on the flight computer. Kevin glanced at him briefly, offering a nod of reassurance. "We've got this," Kevin said, his voice calm but firm. "Just follow my lead." The co-pilot nodded shakily, his confidence slowly returning under Kevin's guidance. Together, they began the descent, the plane slowly leveling out as Kevin expertly maneuvered through the storm clouds. Back in the cabin, the passengers had no idea what was happening behind the closed cockpit door. The only thing they knew was that the plane had stopped its erratic movements, the violent turbulence giving way to a smoother, more controlled flight. But the tension remained thick in the air, and whispers of fear and speculation filled the cabin. Sarah, still standing near the galley, glanced toward the cockpit, her mind reeling from everything that had just happened. She couldn't believe it. Kevin, the man she had dismissed and disrespected, had just taken control of the plane. A man she had judged based on his appearance, without ever knowing who he really was. And now, it was Kevin who held their lives in his hands. The descent into uncertainty. The atmosphere in the cockpit was thick with tension, but Kevin remained calm, his hands steady as he guided the plane into a gradual descent. He could feel the weight of every life on board pressing down on his shoulders, but he was no stranger to pressure. Years of experience flying commercial jets and smaller aircraft had trained him for moments just like this, though rarely under such extreme circumstances. The storm outside continued to rage, dark clouds swirling ominously as lightning occasionally flashed in the distance. The turbulent winds made the plane lurch sporadically, but Kevin's hands remained firm on the yoke. His eyes darted between the altimeter, the artificial horizon, and the radar screen, each instrument telling him what he needed to know to bring the plane down safely. Behind him, the co-pilot was working frantically, his hands moving over the controls as he relayed data to air traffic control and monitored the condition of the plane. Though he was young and relatively inexperienced compared to Kevin, he had begun to regain some of his composure under Kevin's calm leadership. Still, his movements were shaky, and the occasional glance at his unconscious captain showed the underlying fear in his eyes. Kevin glanced at the storm radar and saw that they were still in the heart of the system. It was a bad one, worse than he had anticipated. The turbulence wasn't letting up, and the plane was still being tossed around like a toy in a bathtub. Every jolt sent a ripple of panic through the passengers, though Kevin could no longer see them. He could only imagine the fear that had gripped the cabin behind him. As the plane descended through 20,000 feet, Kevin's mind remained focused on the task ahead. He knew that the storm wasn't the only problem. Yorkton Regional Airport, the nearest emergency landing site, was small, designed for regional traffic, not for a plane of this size. There would be little room for error. The runway was shorter than what commercial jets usually required, and the crosswinds were likely to make the landing even more dangerous. But there was no other option. Yorkton was their best shot, and Kevin knew he could make it work. Flight 262. This is Yorkton Tower. We've cleared the runway for your emergency landing. Wind is from the east at 25 knots, gusting to 40. Expect severe crosswinds. Visibility is reduced to half a mile due to the storm. Good luck, came the voice over the radio, thick with tension but professional. Roger that, Yorkton, Kevin replied. We're beginning our final approach. Request ground support and emergency personnel on standby. We've got them waiting for you, the controller replied. You're cleared for priority landing. Kevin glanced at the co-pilot, who was still monitoring the plane's vital systems. You've got the runway data up? Kevin asked, his voice steady. The co-pilot nodded. Yes, but it's tight. The runway is only 6,000 feet. With the weather and the weight we're carrying, it's going to be close. Kevin's brow furrowed, but he remained outwardly calm. He had landed on short runways before, though rarely under such dire conditions. Still, his confidence didn't waver. He knew what to do. He had done it hundreds of times, just not with an incapacitated captain and a storm battering the plane. We'll make it, Kevin said firmly. Keep an eye on the approach speed. We're going to come in as slow as we can without stalling. Flaps to full once we're on final, and I'll handle the rest. The co-pilot nodded again, visibly relieved to have someone who knew what they were doing. He adjusted the flaps and double-checked the landing gear status as Kevin began the descent into their final approach. As they broke through the cloud cover at around 10,000 feet, the airport finally came into view, a tiny patch of tarmac amidst a sea of swirling clouds and rain. The visibility was terrible. Kevin could barely see the runway, and the crosswinds were already making the plane sway unpredictably. But this was where years of experience came in. Kevin's mind was fully focused on the task at hand, calculating every movement and adjustment needed to bring the plane down safely. The cockpit was eerily quiet, save for the occasional beeping of the instruments and the whine of the engines straining against the storm. Kevin's hands moved smoothly over the controls, adjusting the throttle and correcting the plane's angle of approach. The runway lights were barely visible through the rain and mist, but they were there, guiding him like faint beacons in the storm. "Flaps full," Kevin ordered as they descended below 5,000 feet. "Flaps full," the co-pilot confirmed, his voice steadier now. The plane shuddered violently as another gust of wind hit, but Kevin compensated with a slight adjustment to the yoke. His eyes flicked to the airspeed indicator. Too fast, they'd overshoot the runway. Too slow, they'd stall. It was a delicate balance, one that required precision and nerves of steel. He could feel the weight of the passengers' lives behind him. But he tuned it out, focusing only on the instruments and the runway ahead. As they descended through 2,000 feet, the rain intensified, pounding against the windshield and reducing visibility even further. Kevin's jaw tightened. He could barely see the runway now, and the crosswinds were pushing them off course. He adjusted again, bringing the nose of the plane slightly to the left to compensate. The runway lights flickered in and out of view, but he could still see them, just enough to guide the plane. "Hold steady," Kevin muttered, more to himself than to the co-pilot, who was now gripping the edge of his seat, his knuckles white. At 1,000 feet, the wind hit them hard again, and the plane dipped sharply to the right. Kevin's hands moved quickly, correcting the plane's path, but he could feel the weight of the storm fighting against him. His eyes were locked on the runway, now less than a minute away. The rain was a solid sheet of water against the windshield, the wipers moving frantically but doing little to clear the view. "Landing gear down," Kevin said, his voice still calm. "Gear down and locked," the co-pilot confirmed, his voice trembling slightly. Kevin took a deep breath, centering himself. This was it, the final moments of the approach. Everything depended on this landing. The runway was in sight now, though barely, and the plane was lined up as best as it could be in the gale force winds. Kevin eased back on the throttle, slowing the plane even further as they approached the threshold of the runway. The tires hit the wet tarmac with a loud thud, and for a split second, Kevin felt the jolt of the impact reverberate through the plane. The brakes engaged, but the rain-slick runway made it difficult to slow down. The plane skidded slightly to the right, and Kevin immediately corrected, keeping it centered on the narrow strip of concrete. The runway was shorter than he would have liked, and the plane wasn't slowing down fast enough. The crosswinds were still battering the wings, trying to push the plane off course, but Kevin's hands were firm on the controls. He guided the aircraft with precision, his eyes locked on the end of the runway, which was rapidly approaching. "Reverse thrust," Kevin ordered, his voice tense for the first time. The co-pilot complied, pulling the levers back to engage the reverse thrust, and the plane jolted again as the engines roared in response. Kevin could feel the G-forces pulling against him as the plane struggled to slow down on the slick runway. The end of the tarmac was coming up fast, but they were finally losing speed. At the last possible moment, just as the runway lights disappeared beneath the nose of the plane, the aircraft slowed to a crawl and came to a complete stop. Kevin let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. For a moment, the cockpit was completely silent, save for the faint hum of the engines powering down. "We made it," the co-pilot whispered, his voice barely audible. Kevin nodded, his hand still gripping the yoke as he allowed the reality of what they had just done to sink in. Slowly, he released his grip, his muscles sore from the tension of the descent. He turned to the co-pilot, who looked exhausted but relieved. "Good job," Kevin said quietly, offering a small nod of approval. The co-pilot smiled weakly. "You too. I don't know what we would have done without you." Kevin didn't respond. Instead, he stood up and stepped out of the cockpit, his heart still pounding in his chest. He knew the passengers would be in a state of panic, unaware of just how close they had come to disaster. But for now, all that mattered was that they were safe. As he entered the main cabin, the passengers erupted in applause. Some were crying, others were holding on to each other, but all of them were alive, and they knew it. The flight attendants stood at the front of the cabin, their faces a mixture of shock and gratitude. Even Sarah, who had been so dismissive of Kevin earlier, looked at him with wide eyes, her expression unreadable. Kevin didn't linger on the moment. He was tired, both physically and emotionally. As the applause died down, he made his way back to his seat, passing the passengers who had no idea just how close they had come to the brink. He had done what he always did. He had brought them safely to their destination. But this time, it felt different. As Kevin sat down, his heart rate finally beginning to slow, he couldn't help but wonder how much of the flight's outcome had been influenced by forces beyond just skill and experience. It was as if fate had put him on that plane for a reason, and now that it was over, the weight of what had just happened began to settle on his shoulders. Back at the front of the cabin, Sarah stood frozen for a moment longer before she finally moved toward Kevin, her face still pale, but her eyes filled with something new. Respect. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely audible. I didn't realize." Kevin looked up at her, his expression unreadable. He gave her a small nod, but said nothing. Sometimes words weren't necessary. The aftermath and reflection. The plane sat still on the tarmac, rain pattering softly against the fuselage as emergency vehicles surrounded it, their lights flashing in the misty darkness. The passengers remained seated, many of them still visibly shaken by the ordeal. Some were whispering in hushed tones, others simply stared ahead in silence, as if unsure how to process what had just happened. The tension in the air was palpable, but there was also a deep undercurrent of relief, an unspoken gratitude that they had survived. Kevin leaned back in his seat, his eyes closed for a moment as he allowed himself to exhale slowly. The adrenaline that had surged through his veins during the landing was starting to wear off, leaving him feeling exhausted. His body, now slumped in the plush leather seat, ached from the strain of holding the plane steady through the storm. But the physical exhaustion was nothing compared to the mental toll. He had been in tight situations before, but this one had been different, not because of the technical challenge, but because of the emotional weight of it all. His mind replayed the events of the past hour, the moments of tension in the cockpit, the split-second decisions that had kept the plane from disaster. Kevin had always prided himself on his ability to remain calm under pressure, to think clearly in the face of danger. But there was something about this flight, this particular situation, that gnawed at him. It wasn't just about the emergency landing. It was about everything that had led up to it. The subtle, persistent racism from Sarah, the whispers of judgment from some of the other passengers, the knowing glances and dismissive attitudes he had endured before they even knew who he was or what he could do. Kevin had faced these kinds of microaggressions throughout his entire career. Unspoken assumptions about his abilities, doubts about whether he truly belonged in the pilot's seat. But this time, the stakes had been different. This time, the very people who had looked down on him had depended on him for their lives. The irony wasn't lost on him. As the cabin door finally opened and the emergency personnel began boarding the plane, Kevin remained seated, watching as the passengers around him slowly gathered their belongings. Some were still visibly shaken, their hands trembling as they reached for their bags. Others moved with a kind of mechanical efficiency, their faces blank as if they were still processing the events that had unfolded. The flight attendants, too, were subdued. Alex stood near the galley, speaking quietly with one of the paramedics who had come aboard, while Sarah remained at the front, her eyes fixed on the open door, as if she couldn't bring herself to face the cabin. Kevin noticed her glance at him once or twice, her expression conflicted. He didn't know what she was thinking. And frankly, he didn't care. There was nothing she could say or do that would erase the way she had treated him earlier. He had been judged, dismissed, and disrespected, all because of his skin color and the assumptions people had made about him. And yet, in the end, he had been the one to save them all. As the passengers began to disembark, a few paused to thank him. Some offered a quiet thank you or a nod of appreciation, while others, still in shock, simply gave him a lingering look of gratitude before stepping off the plane. Kevin acknowledged them with a small nod, but he didn't say much. He wasn't looking for accolades or recognition. He had done his job, what he had always done, regardless of whether anyone knew or cared. But then, as the cabin began to empty out, a young woman approached him. She looked to be in her late 20s, her face pale but determined as she stood in front of his seat. Kevin recognized her from earlier in the flight. She had been seated a few rows behind him, one of the few passengers who had noticed the way Sarah had treated him. "Excuse me, sir," she said softly, her voice trembling slightly. "I just wanted to say, I saw what happened. I saw how she treated you, and I'm sorry. You didn't deserve that." Kevin looked up at her, surprised by her words. It wasn't often that people acknowledged what he went through, let alone apologized for it. He studied her for a moment, then gave a small nod. "Thank you," he said simply, his voice quiet but firm. The woman hesitated for a moment, as if unsure whether to say more. But then she gave him a small apologetic smile and turned to leave. Kevin watched her go, a strange mixture of emotions swirling inside him. It wasn't often that people recognized the subtle injustices he faced. Most preferred to pretend they didn't see it, to look the other way. But her words, simple as they were, had struck a chord. As the last few passengers made their way off the plane, Kevin stood up, grabbing his bag from the overhead compartment. He slung it over his shoulder, taking a deep breath as he prepared to leave the aircraft. The flight attendants were still clustered near the front, speaking with the emergency personnel, their faces drawn and weary. Kevin's gaze flicked to Sarah, who had finally turned to face the cabin. Their eyes met, and for a moment, they simply stared at each other in silence. Sarah opened her mouth as if to say something, but no words came. Instead, she swallowed hard, her eyes filled with a mix of regret and guilt. Kevin knew that look. He had seen it before, people realizing, too late, the impact of their actions. But he wasn't interested in hearing her apologies. He had already moved past it. What mattered now was that they were safe, and that the passengers had made it through the ordeal alive. Without another glance, Kevin turned and walked off the plane, his footsteps steady and measured as he made his way down the jet bridge. The cool night air hit him as he stepped outside, the rain still falling in soft sheets, and for a moment, he simply stood there, letting the reality of the situation wash over him. The airport was a blur of activity, emergency vehicles and personnel rushing back and forth, their movements efficient and purposeful. But Kevin felt strangely detached from it all. He had done his part. The crisis was over, and now it was time to move on. He had been through worse, and he would get through this too. As he made his way toward the terminal, a sudden voice behind him broke through his thoughts. "Mr. Parker." Kevin turned to see the co-pilot jogging toward him, his face flushed from exertion, but his eyes filled with gratitude. He stopped a few feet away, panting slightly as he tried to catch his breath. I wanted to thank you," the co-pilot said, his voice earnest. "You saved us all back there. I don't know what we would have done without you." Kevin gave a small nod, his expression calm. "I just did what needed to be done." The co-pilot shook his head, his eyes wide. "No, seriously. I've been flying for a few years now, but I've never seen anything like that. You were incredible. I don't know how you stayed so calm." Kevin offered a faint smile, though there was a weariness behind it. "Experience," he said simply. "You get used to it after a while." The co-pilot looked at him with a mixture of awe and respect, clearly unsure how to respond. For a moment, they stood there in silence, the rain falling steadily around them. Finally, the co-pilot extended his hand. "Thank you," he said again, his voice filled with sincerity. "Really?" Kevin hesitated for a moment before shaking his hand, his grip firm. "Take care of yourself," he said quietly. "And remember, no matter how bad it gets, you can always handle it if you keep a clear head." The co-pilot nodded, his face serious. "I'll remember that." With that, the young man turned and walked back toward the plane, leaving Kevin alone once more. Kevin watched him go, then turned and continued toward the terminal. His mind was already moving past the events of the flight, thinking about what came next. There would be reports to file, statements to give, and no doubt some sort of debriefing with the airline. But for now, all he wanted was to find a quiet place to sit and let the adrenaline drain from his system. As he walked through the terminal, the lights casting long shadows on the wet floor, Kevin's thoughts drifted back to the moments in the cockpit, the rush of decision-making, the intense focus on keeping the plane steady, the way everything else had faded away in the face of the crisis. He had been flying for so long, it was second nature to him now. But this flight had been different. It had tested him in ways he hadn't expected. And yet, as he walked, Kevin couldn't help but feel a quiet sense of satisfaction. He had done what needed to be done. And in the end, that was all that mattered. No matter what anyone thought of him, no matter the assumptions or prejudices, he had proven, once again, that he belonged in the skies. And nothing, not even Sarah's disdain or the judgment of others, could take that away from him. Facing the storm within, the rain had tapered off to a light drizzle by the time Kevin reached the terminal, but the oppressive humidity clung to the air like an invisible weight. He walked slowly, deliberately, his steps echoing off the polished tile floors. The stark fluorescent lights overhead reflected off the rain-soaked surfaces, creating a strange, surreal atmosphere that made the airport feel like a ghost town despite the emergency vehicles and personnel still buzzing around outside. Kevin had been through plenty of chaotic landings and tense moments during his career, but today felt different. The emotional toll was heavier, not just from the physical act of flying the plane through a storm, but from the unspoken tensions that had brewed since the moment he stepped on that aircraft. As he navigated through the terminal, past clusters of paramedics, police officers, and airline personnel, the weight of everything began to sink in. He found a quiet corner near a row of empty chairs and dropped into one, resting his elbows on his knees and his head in his hands. His body ached from the tension of the flight, but his mind was far more fatigued. Kevin wasn't just tired from piloting a plane through a storm. He was tired of fighting the invisible battles, the subtle wars that people like Sarah waged with their glances, their words, their assumptions. He had faced prejudice and discrimination all his life, and he had always risen above it. But something about today had made it harder to brush off, perhaps because the stakes had been so high. His mind wandered back to Sarah's face in the moments after the landing. Her wide, shocked eyes, and the thin line of her lips, struggling to find words. Kevin didn't need an apology from her, but there was something deeply satisfying about knowing that she had realized the truth, that she had been wrong about him. But then again, that realization came at a cost he was all too familiar with. Kevin closed his eyes for a moment, trying to block out the noise of the terminal, but it didn't help. His mind raced through the events of the day, each interaction with Sarah replaying in his head like a looped video. Her snide comments, her dismissive attitude, the way she had treated him like an outsider, even in a first-class cabin. And all of it had come crashing down when she realized who he really was, what he was capable of. A deep, frustrated sigh escaped his lips as he sat up straight, rubbing his temples. He had faced racism in his career before, but there was something about today that struck deeper than usual. Maybe it was because it had happened so openly, in front of dozens of witnesses, with no one stepping in to stop it. Or maybe it was because, despite everything he had done, his years of hard work, his experience, his success, he still found himself in a position where he had to prove his worth, not as a pilot, but as a person. Mr. Parker. Kevin's thoughts were interrupted by a soft voice, and he looked up to see a middle-aged man standing a few feet away, his hands clasped in front of him. The man wore a dark blue airline uniform, his silver hair neatly combed back, and his face was etched with concern. "Yes," Kevin replied, his voice low and measured. He was too tired for formalities. The man stepped forward, his expression earnest. "I'm John Ellison, the Regional Operations Manager for the airline. I just wanted to personally thank you for what you did today. We've been briefed on the situation, and I'm aware that you're not part of the flight crew." I understand that you stepped in during a very critical moment. And he trailed off, as if searching for the right words. We're incredibly grateful. Kevin looked at him, his face impassive. He nodded once, but didn't say anything. There wasn't much to say. It wasn't the first time he'd been thanked for doing what he was trained to do, and he doubted it would be the last. He wasn't in it for the gratitude. He never had been. Is there anything we can do for you? We'll be conducting a thorough investigation, of course, but if there's anything you need, accommodations, transport, please let us know, John added, his tone respectful but tentative, as if sensing Kevin's fatigue. I appreciate it, Kevin said, his voice low. But I don't need anything. I'll just catch the next flight out. John hesitated for a moment, then nodded, his shoulders relaxing slightly. Of course. If you change your mind, you know where to find us. With that, John turned and walked away, leaving Kevin alone once more. The momentary interruption had done little to ease the weight pressing down on him. His thoughts were still spinning, his emotions caught somewhere between exhaustion, frustration, and something else, something harder to define. He thought about the other passengers, the way they had watched the situation unfold. Most of them had said nothing during the flight, content to sit back and observe, to let the tension simmer without getting involved. Kevin understood why. People were often afraid to speak up, afraid to be seen as the ones making waves. But their silence had been louder than any words they could have spoken. It had hung in the air, thick and heavy, like an unspoken agreement that it wasn't their place to intervene. Kevin had always been the one to rise above. He had been taught from a young age to keep your head down, work twice as hard, and let your actions speak for themselves. And he had done exactly that. He had built a successful career, earned the respect of his peers, and risen through the ranks of an industry that had never made it easy for someone like him to succeed. But even now, after all these years, it seemed like his actions still weren't enough. The soft hum of voices in the terminal began to fade as the crowd thinned out. The emergency vehicles outside were starting to pull away, their lights dimming as they drove off into the night. The storm had moved on, leaving only a misty haze over the runway. It was eerily quiet now, as if the entire airport was holding its breath. Kevin stood up, feeling the stiffness in his muscles as he stretched. His thoughts were still swirling, but he knew he couldn't sit here forever, brooding over things he couldn't change. He had done his job. He had saved those people, despite everything, despite the way he had been treated. And that was what mattered. As he picked up his bag and turned to head toward the exit, a familiar voice called out from behind him. Mr. Parker, wait. Kevin turned to see Sarah, the flight attendant, hurrying toward him. She looked different now. Her usual polished appearance had been replaced by something more vulnerable. Her hair, once perfectly coiffed, was now slightly disheveled, and her face was pale. But it wasn't her appearance that caught Kevin's attention. It was the look in her eyes. The arrogance, the superiority had been replaced by something he hadn't expected, humility. I need to talk to you, Sarah said, her voice shaky. Kevin crossed his arms over his chest, waiting for her to speak. He wasn't sure what she could say that would make a difference, but he was curious. Sarah paused, her eyes searching his face. I wanted to apologize for everything. The way I treated you, the things I said, the assumptions I made. I was wrong. Kevin's expression remained unreadable as he studied her. He could see the sincerity in her eyes, the regret that she was clearly struggling to express. But an apology wasn't what he needed. Not now. I've worked for this airline for years, Sarah continued, her voice trembling slightly. I've seen all kinds of people in first class, and I guess I thought I had everyone figured out. But today I realized I don't know anything. She swallowed hard, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. You saved us, all of us, and I treated you like you didn't even belong there. I'm so sorry. Kevin let her words hang in the air for a moment, the weight of her apology settling between them. He could see the pain in her eyes, The realization that she had been wrong, not just about him, but about so much more. She had made snap judgments, the kind that people like him faced every day, and now she was forced to confront the consequences of those assumptions. "I don't need your apology," Kevin said quietly, his voice calm but firm. "What I need is for you to understand that this isn't just about today. This happens all the time, and not just to me. To people who look like me, who don't fit into the boxes you've created in your mind." Sarah nodded, her face crumpling slightly as she processed his words. "I do understand," she whispered, "or at least I'm starting to." Kevin looked at her for a long moment, then gave a small nod. He wasn't interested in dragging this out. He had already moved past it, but he hoped that she would take this moment and learn from it. That she would carry it with her the next time she made assumptions about someone based on nothing more than the color of their skin or the way they dressed. "Good," Kevin said simply, "because it's not about proving anything to you. It's about doing what's right. For everyone." With that, he turned and walked away, leaving Sarah standing alone in the terminal, her apology lingering in the air like the last echo of the storm. As Kevin stepped outside into the cool night air, he felt a strange sense of clarity wash over him. He had always been the one to rise above, to keep his head down and do his job, regardless of what people thought of him. But today had been different. Today, he had been reminded of the power of standing tall, of refusing to be diminished by the small minds of others. The storm had passed, but the lessons it had left behind would linger long after the skies cleared. The sky ahead. Kevin stepped out of the terminal into the cool night air, feeling the weight of the day slowly lift off his shoulders. The rain had finally stopped, leaving behind a fresh, clean scent that filled the night. The distant rumble of departing planes echoed across the runway, but for the first time in hours, everything felt calm. He paused just outside the doors, letting the quiet embrace him. For a moment, Kevin simply stood there, breathing in the crisp air and feeling the tension ease from his body. The conversation with Sarah still lingered in his mind, not because of what she had said, but because of what it represented. He had dealt with people like her his entire life. People who judged him before they knew him, who saw only the surface and never bothered to look deeper. He'd learned to live with it, to navigate around it, to prove himself over and over again. But something about today had shifted his perspective. He wasn't just tired of fighting these battles. He was ready to confront them head-on. The terminal doors slid open behind him, and Kevin glanced back to see the other passengers emerging, their faces a mixture of relief and exhaustion. They moved quietly, some talking in hushed voices, others walking silently toward the waiting cars and taxis. He saw a few of them glance his way, their eyes filled with gratitude. One or two even nodded at him as they passed, their expressions carrying a silent acknowledgement of what he had done. Kevin returned the gesture, though he remained in his quiet corner, observing from the periphery. He wasn't looking for praise, and he certainly didn't need validation from people who had ignored him when it mattered, but there was a small comfort in knowing that, at least for now, they understood. As Kevin turned to leave, heading toward the parking area where his rental car awaited, he heard a voice call out behind him. "Kevin, wait." He stopped, turning to see Alex, the young flight attendant from earlier, hurrying toward him. His face was flushed from running, but there was a determined look in his eyes. I'm glad I caught you," Alex said, breathless as he reached Kevin. "I wanted to say thank you again, and I didn't want to leave without talking to you." Kevin raised an eyebrow, curious. "You already thanked me back on the plane. There's no need." Alex shook his head. "No, it's more than that. I've been thinking a lot about what happened today. I saw how Sarah treated you, how everyone just let it happen. And I didn't do anything. I should have said something. I should have stood up for you." Kevin studied him for a moment, seeing the sincerity in his eyes. There was something in Alex's expression, something genuine, raw. It wasn't just guilt. It was a real desire to understand, to be better. Kevin had encountered people like Alex before. people who meant well, who wanted to be allies, but didn't always know how. It was a difficult place to be, especially when the system itself made it easier to remain silent. "You're young," Kevin said, his tone measured but not unkind. "You've got time to figure this out, but you need to understand something. It's not about standing up for me. It's about recognizing when something's wrong and having the courage to do what's right, whether it's me or someone else." Alex's face tightened, and he nodded. "I know. I've been thinking about that a lot. It's hard sometimes, you know. You don't want to make things worse or cause trouble." Kevin nodded. "It's always going to be hard, but staying silent makes things worse. Trust me. I've been on the receiving end of that silence too many times to count." Alex looked down, his expression troubled. "I'll do better. I promise." Kevin gave him a small smile, feeling a pang of hope. "That's all anyone can ask. Just be aware, pay attention, and don't let fear keep you from doing what's right." Alex looked up, his eyes filled with determination. "I won't. I mean it." There was a moment of silence between them, the night air heavy with unspoken words. Kevin appreciated the young man's sincerity, but he also knew that change wasn't going to happen overnight. It was a long, slow process, and Alex had just taken his first step. It was a start. "Take care of yourself," Kevin said, offering his hand. Alex shook it firmly, a newfound sense of resolve in his grip. "You too, and thanks again for everything." With that, Alex turned and walked back toward the terminal, leaving Kevin alone once more. The conversation lingered in Kevin's mind as he made his way to the rental car lot. It was strange how today had unfolded, not just the emergency landing, but everything leading up to it. The storm, Sarah's attitude, the way the passengers had watched, silent and complicit. And yet, in the midst of it all, there had been moments of clarity. Alex's apology, Sarah's realization, the few passengers who had acknowledged the wrongs they had witnessed. Small moments, perhaps, but they meant something. Kevin unlocked the car and tossed his bag in the back seat, sinking into the driver's seat with a heavy sigh. He sat there for a moment, his hands resting on the steering wheel as he stared out at the dark, rain-slicked tarmac. The lights of the airport shimmered in the distance, casting long shadows across the pavement. This wasn't the first time Kevin had dealt with racism, and it wouldn't be the last. But today, something had shifted inside him. He had always been content to rise above, to let his actions speak louder than words. But now, he realized that sometimes words were just as important. Sometimes, you had to confront the people who doubted you, the ones who judged you before they knew you, not for their sake, but for your own. Kevin started the car and pulled out of the lot, the soft hum of the engine filling the silence. As he drove through the dark streets leading away from the airport, his thoughts wandered back to his life as a pilot, the countless flights he had taken, the people he had met, the challenges he had faced. He had spent his entire career proving himself, proving that he belonged in a space that wasn't always welcoming to people who looked like him, and he had succeeded time and time again. But now, as the miles stretched out before him, Kevin realized that it wasn't just about proving himself anymore. It was about claiming his space, unapologetically, and demanding that others recognize his worth without him having to prove it over and over again. It was about standing tall in the face of those who doubted him, not because he needed their approval, but because he refused to let them diminish his achievements. As the road stretched out ahead of him, Kevin thought about what the future held. There would be more flights, more passengers, more challenges, and there would be more people like Sarah, people who judged him, who saw only the surface and never bothered to look deeper. But now he felt a renewed sense of purpose, a determination not just to rise above, but to confront the ignorance head-on. The storm had passed, both outside and within him, and as Kevin drove into the night, the road ahead felt clearer than it had in a long time. Hours later, Kevin found himself pulling into a small, quiet town where he had planned to spend a few days before his next flight. The streets were empty, and the only sound was the soft rustling of leaves in the cool breeze. He parked in front of a modest inn, the kind of place that didn't ask too many questions and offered a warm bed after a long day. The soft glow of the porch light welcomed him as he grabbed his bag and headed inside. The innkeeper, an older woman with kind eyes, greeted him warmly, handing him a room key with a soft smile. "Long day?" she asked, her voice gentle. Kevin nodded, returning the smile. "Yeah, you could say that." She didn't press for details, and Kevin was grateful for that. He was tired of talking, tired of thinking. All he wanted now was a few hours of quiet, to rest and let the day's events fade into the background. As he entered his room, a small but cozy space with a simple bed and a window overlooking the quiet street, Kevin felt a sense of peace settle over him. He dropped his bag on the floor and sat on the edge of the bed, running a hand through his short-cropped hair. The exhaustion was finally catching up with him, but it was a good kind of tired, the kind that came after a long battle, knowing you had emerged stronger. For a moment, he allowed himself to think about the future, about the flights yet to come, the passengers he would meet, the challenges he would face. But this time, he wasn't thinking about proving himself. This time, he was thinking about something deeper, about how far he had come, and how much further he would go. Kevin lay back on the bed, closing his eyes as the sound of the wind outside lulled him into a quiet, dreamless sleep. Tomorrow would come, and with it new challenges. But for now, the storm had passed, and Kevin Parker was ready for whatever lay ahead.